The sound of my jaw breaking was the sound of my old life ending. I just didn't know it yet. I should have seen it coming that Tuesday evening in our McLean kitchen, the one with the marble countertops and the Sub-Zero refrigerator that cost more than most people's cars. My mother Eleanor always said appearances were everything, and our house was the perfect illusion. From the outside, we were the American dream. A successful businessman father, a socialite mother, a golden boy son destined for greatness, and me, Harper, the daughter who existed to make everyone else look good. But that night, when I told the truth about Ethan's laziness, about how he hadn't actually done any of the work on his latest business proposal, my father Robert didn't hesitate. His fist connected with my face before I could even register what was happening. The pain was immediate and blinding, but worse than the physical agony was the sound of my mother's laughter echoing through that pristine kitchen. She didn't move to help me. She didn't gasp in horror. She laughed, a cold, brittle sound that cut deeper than any punch ever could. Ethan stood there with his arms crossed, that smirk I knew so well playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked satisfied, vindicated even, as I collapsed to the floor, my hand instinctively reaching for my face. Blood dripped onto the white tile, and all I could think was that Eleanor would be furious about the stain. I don't remember much of that night after the hospital. Robert drove me himself, spinning some story about a fall down the stairs to the emergency room doctor who looked at me with sympathetic but knowing eyes. She'd seen this before, I could tell. But I was too ashamed, too broken to say anything. I nodded along with the lie, got my jaw wired, and went home to that beautiful, suffocating house in the suburbs. The weeks that followed were a blur of soft foods and silence. I couldn't talk properly with my jaw wired shut, which seemed almost poetic. They had literally silenced me. But something had shifted inside me that night on the kitchen floor. As I lay there bleeding, staring up at the recessed lighting that cost $3,000 to install, I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. It wasn't just pain, it was clarity. I started to see everything differently. The way my mother would casually mention that I looked tired or that my clothes didn't quite fit right, always in front of other people. The way my father would sigh heavily whenever I entered his study, as if my mere presence was an inconvenience. The way Ethan would borrow money, my money, and never pay it back, always with some excuse about an investment opportunity that never materialized. I had been blind for so long, desperate for their approval, convinced that if I just tried harder, sacrificed more, loved them better, they would finally see my worth. But lying in my childhood bed with my jaw throbbing and my heart shattered, I realized they would never see me as anything other than a tool to be used. My recovery was slow, but I used that time wisely. I became invisible, which wasn't hard. I had been practicing invisibility my whole life. I went to my job at the local bookstore, came home, ate dinner in silence, and retreated to my room. They seemed relieved that I had learned my lesson, that I had been properly put in my place. What they didn't know was that I was planning. I had been saving money for years, secret stashes hidden in an old shoebox in my closet. It was my escape fund, my ticket to freedom. I was going to move to New York, start fresh, maybe finally pursue the writing career I had always dreamed about. But 3 months after the incident, I discovered the money was gone. All of it. $12,000. Vanished. When I confronted my mother, she barely looked up from her phone. Ethan needed it for a business opportunity, she said, as if that explained everything. As if my money, my dreams, my future, meant nothing compared to another one of my brother's schemes. I felt something inside me crack further, but I didn't show it. I just nodded and walked away. That was when the sabotage started, though it took me a while to connect the dots. I had finally gotten a call back for an interview in Seattle, a position at a publishing house that felt like fate. It was perfect, everything I had been working toward. But 2 days before my scheduled interview, my manager at the bookstore informed me that my hours were being cut due to budget constraints. I couldn't afford the plane ticket anymore. Then my car, the old Honda Civic that I had bought with my own money and maintained religiously, mysteriously broke down the morning of a local job interview. The mechanic said it looked like someone had tampered with the engine, but he couldn't be sure. I missed the interview. The pattern was becoming clear. I started documenting everything. I had an old laptop from high school hidden in a memory box under my bed, and I would wait until everyone was asleep before taking it out. I created a folder, password protected, and began keeping a record. Every cruel comment, every instance of financial manipulation, every time they undermined my efforts to build an independent life. I bought a small notebook that I kept in my pillowcase and wrote down everything I could remember from the past. Dates, times, witnesses. It felt dangerous and exhilarating, this secret rebellion. For the first time in my life, I was taking control, even if they didn't know it yet. I started spending my afternoons at the Arlington Central Library, using their computers to research and organize my evidence. It was safer there, away from the house where I always felt watched. The opportunity I had been waiting for came one evening when Eleanor left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to take a call in the other room. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she would hear it, but I acted on instinct. I grabbed the phone and quickly scrolled through her messages and emails. What I found made my stomach turn. There were texts to her friends mocking me, calling me useless and stupid. There were emails about gambling debts, thousands of dollars lost at some private poker club in Georgetown. And then I found the messages with my father, discussing how they had used my college fund to cover Ethan's losses from a failed cryptocurrency investment. My college fund. The one my grandparents had set up for me before they died. They had stolen it and never told me. I took screenshots of everything, sending them to an anonymous email account I had created at the library. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone, but I got what I needed before Eleanor returned. She picked up her phone without even glancing at me, still laughing into it about some country club drama. After that, I became bolder. I knew where my father kept his important business documents, in an old desk drawer in his study that he never bothered to lock because who would dare go through his things? I did. I went through everything. I found receipts for transactions that made no sense, contracts with shell companies, records of bribes disguised as consulting fees. My father, the respected businessman, was a fraud. The evidence against Ethan was almost too easy to collect. My brother had a drinking problem, though everyone in the family pretended not to notice. When he was drunk, he loved to brag. One night, I found him on the back patio, whiskey in hand, talking on the phone to one of his equally useless friends. I stood in the shadows of the doorway with my old phone recording as he laughed about how he had convinced Dad to call my Seattle employer and spread rumors about me being unreliable. How he had paid our neighbor's kid $50 to mess with my car. How he had been laundering money through his various business ventures for months. He was so drunk he never noticed me standing there, watching him casually destroy any remaining illusions I had about my family. When he finally stumbled inside and passed me, he didn't even see me. I was a ghost in my own home, and I had finally realized that was my greatest advantage. I needed help, though. I couldn't do this alone. Daniel had been my best friend in college, one of the few genuine relationships I had managed to maintain despite my family's interference. He had moved to Baltimore after graduation and worked in cybersecurity. We had kept in touch sporadically, mostly through emails and the occasional coffee when he was in the area. I called him one afternoon from the library and asked if we could meet. He suggested a small cafe in downtown Arlington, neutral territory. When I showed up with a folder full of printed documents and told him everything, I watched his expression change from concern to disbelief to cold anger. Daniel was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. He kept looking at the photographs I had printed, the medical report from the night my jaw was broken, the screenshots of my mother's emails, the evidence of my father's financial crimes. Finally, he looked up at me and said he would help. He didn't ask questions about legality or consequences. He just said yes. We spent weeks planning. Daniel explained what he could do with the digital evidence I had collected, how we could create a presentation that would be impossible to ignore or deny. But we needed the right moment, the right audience. We needed to make sure that when the truth came out, there would be witnesses, people who mattered, people whose opinions my family actually cared about. The opportunity came in the form of Ethan's product launch party. He had been working on some tech startup, or rather, he had been taking credit for work that other people had done, and he had somehow convinced several investors to back him. The launch party was going to be huge, held at the Willard Intercontinental Hotel in Washington, D.C., one of the most prestigious venues in the city. My father had spared no expense, inviting politicians, business leaders, journalists, everyone who was anyone in D.C. society. It was perfect. It was exactly what I needed. Daniel and I planned every detail. We would need access to the hotel's AV system, which Daniel assured me he could handle remotely once we got the right information. I managed to volunteer to help with the event setup, playing the role of the dutiful daughter, eager to support her brother's big night. No one questioned it. Why would they? I was Harper, the invisible one, the one who existed to serve. The night before the event, Daniel planted a small device in the hotel's media room during a reconnaissance visit. It was tiny, unnoticeable, and it would give him complete control over what appeared on the screens during Ethan's presentation. We tested it twice to make sure it would work. There would be no second chances. The night of the launch party, I dressed carefully. I chose a black dress that I had bought with my last paycheck, simple but elegant, and I did my makeup precisely. I wanted to look like I belonged there, like I was just another guest, not the family scapegoat. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked confident. I looked dangerous. The Willard was stunning that night, all chandeliers and champagne and people in expensive clothes pretending to be interested in Ethan's pitch. I moved through the crowd carefully, smiling and nodding, playing my part. I saw my mother holding court near the bar, draped in diamonds, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. I saw my father networking aggressively, his hand always on someone's shoulder, his voice booming with false joviality. And I saw Ethan, cocky and smiling, accepting congratulations for work he hadn't done, basking in attention he hadn't earned. I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming. The presentation was scheduled for 8 o'clock. By 7:45, everyone had been ushered into the main ballroom. The lights dimmed, and my father took the stage first. He gave a speech about hard work and family values and the American dream, his voice full of pride as he talked about his son's accomplishments. I stood in the back, watching the audience nod approvingly, and I thought about the irony of a man who had beaten his daughter talking about family values. Then Ethan took the stage. He was in his element, confident and charming, telling stories about his vision and his innovation. He talked about disrupting industries and changing the world, all the buzzwords that investors love to hear. People were smiling, nodding, pulling out their phones to take notes. This was going exactly as my family had planned. Except it wasn't. Daniel was in a Starbucks 3 blocks away, laptop open, waiting for my signal. When Ethan announced that he would now show a video presentation about his product, I sent Daniel a single text. The word was simple: now. I watched Ethan's face as the screen behind him flickered. He frowned, probably thinking it was a technical glitch. He turned to look at the screen, and that's when his expression changed. That's when everyone's expressions changed. The video that appeared wasn't Ethan's carefully crafted promotional material. It was a slideshow of evidence. The first image was a scanned receipt showing a payment from my father's company to a city official, marked as consulting fees but clearly a bribe. The audience murmured. Some people leaned forward. Phones came out, but not to take notes anymore. They were recording. The next slide was even worse. It was a screenshot of my mother's text messages, where she called me worthless and stupid, where she discussed using my education fund to pay off her gambling debts. The room was no longer murmuring. People were gasping, turning to look at each other in shock. But I wasn't done. The coup de grace was the video of Ethan, drunk and laughing, bragging about sabotaging my career. His voice filled the ballroom, slurred and cruel, as he described calling my potential employers and lying about me, as he joked about paying someone to damage my car, as he casually discussed laundering money through fake business accounts. And then, just to make sure everyone understood the stakes, the presentation showed photos. Photos of my bruised face the night my father broke my jaw, photos of medical records, photos of the texts where my family coordinated to keep me trapped and dependent. The final slide was text, white words on a black background. Behind this glamorous facade lies abuse, fraud, and the destruction of a life. They taught me lessons about cruelty. Now it's time I teach them one back. The ballroom erupted. People were shouting, some in outrage, some trying to leave. Reporters were pushing forward with their cameras and microphones. Investors were demanding explanations. And my family stood on that stage, frozen like statues, their faces drained of all color. I walked through the chaos toward the stage. People moved out of my way, staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time. Maybe they were. I climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, until I was standing face to face with the 3 people who had made my life a living hell. My father recovered first. He lunged at me, his face twisted with rage, but hotel security grabbed him before he could reach me. Daniel had warned them there might be an incident, had shown them just enough evidence to make sure they would be ready. My mother collapsed into a chair, her perfect makeup running with fake tears. And Ethan just stood there, shaking, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I looked at each of them in turn, and then I spoke. My voice was steady, amplified by the microphone Ethan had been using moments before. You taught me that silence was weakness. Now I'm no longer silent. And this is the price for the silence you forced me to endure. I didn't wait for their response. I walked off that stage, through the crowd of stunned guests, and out of the Willard. Daniel was waiting in his car at the corner. I got in, and we drove away as the first police sirens began to wail in the distance. I had called them anonymously an hour before the presentation, tipping them off to the evidence of fraud and money laundering that would be revealed. They had been standing by, waiting. The aftermath was everything I had hoped for, and nothing I had expected. The story exploded across every news outlet in the D.C. area by morning. Reporters camped outside my family's house in McLean. My father's business was raided by federal investigators. Ethan's investors pulled out immediately, and several of them filed lawsuits. My mother became a social pariah overnight, banned from her country clubs and charity boards. I gave my statement to the police, a full account of everything that had happened, backed up by all the evidence I had so carefully collected. I was calm and clear, and for the first time in my life, people listened to me. They actually listened. The legal proceedings took months. My father was charged with multiple counts of fraud and bribery. Ethan faced charges related to money laundering and conspiracy. My mother wasn't charged criminally, but the civil suits from people she had swindled or insulted ate through whatever remained of the family fortune. Their perfect house in McLean went up for sale. The Mercedes and the BMW were repossessed. Everything they had built their identity on crumbled into dust. I didn't stay to watch it all unfold. 2 weeks after the launch party, I packed what little I owned into my newly repaired Honda and drove to New York City. Daniel had helped me find a small apartment in Queens, nothing fancy, but it was mine. All mine. No one could take it from me or tell me I didn't deserve it. I got a job at a small independent bookstore in Brooklyn. The pay wasn't great, but the owner was kind, and she didn't ask too many questions about my past. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since college. Late at night, in my tiny apartment with its creaky floors and temperamental heating, I would sit at my laptop and write. I wrote about pain and survival. I wrote about breaking free. I wrote about the price of silence and the power of truth. Sometimes, people recognized me. The story had been big enough that my face had been on the news for weeks. But mostly, people in New York didn't care. They had their own problems, their own stories. I was just another person trying to make it in the city, and there was something beautifully anonymous about that. 6 months after the launch party, I received a letter from Daniel. He had been following the legal proceedings closely, updating me when I asked, but mostly giving me the space I needed to heal. The letter contained news I had been waiting for. My father had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud and bribery. Ethan got 5 years for money laundering and conspiracy to commit fraud. The family assets had been seized to pay restitution to the people they had defrauded. My mother, the letter said, was living in a small apartment in Arlington, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Her friends had abandoned her. Her social standing was gone. She was, for the first time in her life, truly alone with the consequences of her actions. I read the letter sitting on the fire escape of my apartment building, watching the sun set over the Queen's skyline. I thought about how I should feel: triumphant, vindicated, satisfied. But mostly, I just felt free. The weight that had been crushing me for 26 years was finally gone. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their love. I didn't even need their acknowledgement of what they had done to me. What I needed was exactly what I had: a life of my own choosing, a future that I controlled. Relationships built on respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and manipulation. I had friends now, real ones, people who saw me and valued me for who I actually was. I had my writing, which was slowly improving. I had possibilities. The scar on my jaw was still there, a thin white line that I could feel when I touched my face. For a long time, I had hidden it with makeup and careful angles in photos. But I stopped doing that. The scar was part of my story, proof that I had survived, that I had fought back. It wasn't a mark of shame, it was a mark of strength. A year after everything happened, I sold my first piece of writing. It was an essay about toxic families and the myth of unconditional love, about the courage it takes to walk away from people who hurt you, even when society tells you that family is everything. The editor who bought it told me it was the most honest thing she had read in years. It was published in a small literary magazine, nothing glamorous, but seeing my name in print felt like vindication. I never heard from my family again. My mother tried to call once, about 8 months after the trial. I let it go to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. That was the only contact. Part of me wondered if they ever thought about what they had done, if they ever felt remorse or understood how deeply they had damaged me. But mostly, I didn't wonder. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the life I was building. I started taking a writing class at a community college. I made friends with my coworkers at the bookstore. I dated a little, though I was cautious, still learning what healthy relationships looked like. I went to therapy, which helped more than I expected. I learned about boundaries and self-worth and the difference between forgiveness and enabling. My therapist asked me once if I regretted what I had done, if I felt guilty about destroying my family. I thought about it for a long time before answering. No, I finally said. They destroyed themselves. I just made sure everyone could see it, and that was the truth. I hadn't fabricated evidence or lied or exaggerated. I had simply shown the world who they really were beneath the expensive clothes and the charming smiles. The rest had been their own doing, the natural consequences of years of cruelty and corruption. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would think about that moment on the kitchen floor, blood on the white tiles, my mother's laughter ringing in my ears. It felt like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to someone else. In a way, it had. The Harper who had lain there, broken and humiliated, didn't exist anymore. She had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her worth, someone who would never again let anyone treat her as less than human. I thought about Ethan's smirk and my father's fist and my mother's indifference, and I felt nothing but distant pity. They had taught me about cruelty, yes, but they had also inadvertently taught me about resilience. They had tried to break me, to keep me small and dependent and afraid. Instead, they had forged me into someone capable of fighting back, of standing up, of demanding better. The book I was working on, a memoir about toxic families and personal transformation, was almost finished. My agent, a sharp woman named Rebecca who reminded me of what Eleanor could have been if she had channeled her intelligence into something worthwhile, thought we had a good chance of finding a publisher. Even if we didn't, Even if it never saw the light of day beyond my laptop, the process of writing it had been healing. Every word was an act of reclamation, a way of taking back the narrative that my family had tried to write for me. I stood at the window of my apartment one evening in early spring, watching the city lights flicker to life as darkness fell. My reflection stared back at me, and I saw someone I recognized and respected. The scar on my jaw caught the light, a thin silver line that told a story of survival. I had not just taken revenge, I had taken back my life. I had proven that the power they held over me was only as real as I allowed it to be. When I stopped being afraid, when I stopped hoping for their love and approval, they had nothing left to hurt me with. That was the real victory, not the criminal charges or the financial ruin or the public humiliation, though those had been satisfying. The real victory was standing here, in my own apartment, living a life of my own creation, finally free. The girl who had been broken on that kitchen floor was gone, but she hadn't been destroyed. She had been transformed. The pain had not defeated me, it had revealed my strength. The betrayal had not crushed me, it had taught me who I could trust and who I couldn't. The scars, physical and emotional, were not marks of shame but medals of honor, proof that I had fought and won. I had given them back exactly what they had given me, not with violence but with truth. I had shown them their own reflection, and they had been destroyed by what they saw. They had taught me about cruelty, and I had taught them about consequences. That seemed like a fair trade. As I turned away from the window and back to my laptop, where my manuscript waited, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but peace. The war was over. I had won. And now, finally, I could begin to live.